Morning. Can you hear me? Is that loud enough? That's loud enough. Welcome to Rolling Hills, to our Bible class hour. We begin a new class this morning on the book of Daniel. Book of Daniel. We'll talk some about that. And we're going to introduce the book today. We won't get into much of the text until the next class, which will be, I think, week after next. I think next week the CLIC, the church leader instructional camp guys will be speaking. In our announcements, we have several. Billy Caudle, your surgery has been scheduled for the 18th of June, and you ain't a bit nervous. Be in the hospital for 3 to 5 days. Judy Cockrell, I don't see. Still, had a bad week. Judy had a bad week. Mike and Karen's mother, Sue, continues to need our prayers. Hilda Donathan, that's Jerry Paul's sister, is not did not get good news concerning her cancer. Keith G. He's the song leader at Olive Hill. I know you're going to laugh, but I didn't even know his name was Keith. We always call him Beetle G. And he's the song leader up at Olive Hill, and he's in bad shape with pancreatic cancer. Robert Glass continues to need our prayers. Joanne, you were in the hospital last week, and you're here now. Are you better? You're okay. Well, that's good. Arthur Johnson. Oh, Carolyn Keith failed. Betty's not here, is she, to tell us about that? Where's that voice coming from? I can't tell. Oh, right here. I'm sorry. I'm deaf. I can't tell. Say that again now. Wednesday, it says here. MRI scheduled for Wednesday to see if surgery is an option. Carolyn Keith fell and fractured some vertebrae in her back. She is home with patches to help with pain. Gary Lacey's liver numbers are out of whack, and so anytime you have a transplant and you go back and your numbers are out of whack, you start thinking the worst, and so pray for Gary. John Moore is... It says on here recovering, but he's not recovering too well. He's very weak and sick this morning, but here with us, and has 3 more tests coming up. And John and Edna's daughter-in-law, Vicki, had outpatient kidney procedure in Lexington and also battling cancer. How's Emily, Sherry?
Well, they're giving her as high blood pressure medicine as they can. It's just a waiting game.
So they're giving her as strong a blood pressure medicine as she can stand being pregnant, but and they're just waiting. Tommy Oakley called. I don't think Tommy and Ruby's here today. Tommy called Friday and has not been doing well for 3 weeks now, having some sort of horrible pain and infection, and they can't seem to find it. And they'll give him a shot and relieve it for a little while, and it'll come right back. So keep him in your prayers. Aaron Pirasol has some health issues. That's Elizabeth's son. And Mallory's grandmother, we heard that she had been baptized, Shirley Ridge, in hospice care. Crystal Stinson's mother is facing possible foot and leg amputation. Jeff Tipton was in the hospital this past week. Where are the Tiptons? Oh, there you are. He was in the hospital, but he's home now, right?
Yeah, we see a surgeon tomorrow.
He's what?
See a surgeon
tomorrow for his foot. He has a broken foot and may have to have it operated on. Surgeon in Lexington tomorrow. And Gerald Vinson and Vernon Tipton both continue to need our prayers. Who else do we need to mention? Danny?
Brother Baker, preacher at Campton.
Yes.
He's had several bad weeks, and we'll go see a surgeon Tuesday.
Brother Guy Baker of Campton has been battling throat cancer for some time and has had a couple of bad weeks and goes to see a surgeon Tuesday. And so keep Brother Guy. He's a good man, and he comes down and supports things that we do. Just enjoy having him around. And so keep him in your prayers. Who else? Yes. Oh, he has pneumonia. Her grandfather, Tom, is 103. I read about him in the Kentucky Living magazine one time. I think that was when he turned 100 or maybe 101. He's still going, but he has pneumonia, and that can be devastating for a 103-year-old. So keep him in your prayers. Who else do we need to mention? Fairfax summer series starts this Tuesday. I get to do the first week, Tuesday the 4th. And my subject is what the world was like before the sin in creation in Genesis 1 and 2. I wasn't there. You young people, I'm not quite that old. But I have some information about it. So we'll talk about that. Anything else we need to mention before we begin? Tommy Cottle, you feel like leading us in a prayer? Thank you, Tom. When I say Daniel, you think what? First thing pops in your mind, Daniel. Lion's den, lion's den. What else? What's the second thing? Fiery furnace. Big statue, big dream of a big statue made out of all different kinds of metal. Handwriting on the wall, yeah. A handwriting with no body attached to it. So we are familiar with a lot of things in Daniel, aren't we? The first 6 chapters especially, because those are the easy ones. Chapter 7 through 12 is a series of visions, 4 visions of apocalyptic nature, very much like Revelation. And there are a lot of similarities between those 2 books, and a lot of the same apocalyptic type terms are used. And we'll talk about that. But this morning we just want to kind of familiarize ourselves with the book and maybe some things that you've thought of or haven't thought of about the book of Daniel. This is not moving, guys. I'm pushing it with all my little thumb will do. There you go. Notable events in Daniel. First of all, Daniel was among the captives of Babylon, of the Babylonians, when they... You remember when we studied the minor prophets? How many of you were in the minor prophet class here? You remember the big event that the minor prophets worried about and talked about and warned about? What was that big catastrophic event? Destruction of Jerusalem and Babylonian captivity. The Babylonians are coming. God is, if you don't straighten up, God's going to allow you to be taken into captivity. And apparently they didn't straighten up. And so God allowed that to happen the first time, the first captives in about 605. And Daniel was among those captives, and the first chapter starts out with, opens with telling us about that, and the fact that some of the choicest young men, teenagers apparently, maybe 15, 16, were taken into captivity, and among those there were some chosen to serve King Nebuchadnezzar himself, to work in the palace and serve there. And they had to have Nebuchadnezzar, I guess there's people like this that live in the United States, but I don't know any that are so rich and so spoiled that even they dictate the kind of people who come into their presence. And Nebuchadnezzar didn't want just any scrawny, pimply teenager. He wanted to feed them with certain things and have them drink certain things and have them look a certain way and dress a certain way before they would even come into his presence. And you remember that involved eating food that would have been unclean for Jews. And Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, wouldn't do that. They didn't want to do it, and so the man in charge of them said, "You're going to get me in trouble. You're not going to eat these things, and you're going to look poor and worse than all the rest of them." And he's going to say, "Why didn't you fatten these up too? Or why don't these look fit to be in my presence?" And so Daniel relied upon God. He wouldn't compromise. He said, "Give me 10 days and look at us and see when we eat things that don't defile us, vegetables and water. Give us 10 days and look at us." He did, and of course God had blessed them with a fairer countenance than all the others, and they excelled. That's what chapter 1 is about, and found favor with the king. Also, we read about Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, and it was a dream that of a great statue, and it was about the future. And Nebuchadnezzar had an interesting request, didn't he? To his wise men, the Chaldean wise men and magicians. What did he ask them to do? Not just interpret the dream. Tell me what I dreamed. Boy, that's a tall order, isn't it? I'm glad y'all don't know what I dreamed. I'm glad you don't see all that stuff in there. Nothing sinful, nothing horrible, but some wild stuff goes on. But anyway, he said, "Tell me what I dreamed." And they said, "That's impossible. You tell us what you dreamed, we'll tell you what it meant." And he said, "No, it's not going to work that way, because you're just buying time. You could make up anything. Maddox could tell you what it meant if you told him what the dream was. I guarantee it'd have something to do with Minecraft or Avengers or something. But anyway, finally, he put out an order to kill all those wise men. If you can't tell me what this dream is, I'm just going to put you to death. And Daniel was brought, and God blessed him with the interpretation. Interesting thing about chapter 2, at the end of verse 4, the book begins to be written in Aramaic, which is the language of the Chaldeans. And most of the Old Testament is Hebrew, written in Hebrew, and the New Testament written in Koine Greek. But Daniel, from chapter 2 and verse 4 at the end of the chapter through chapter 7 and verse 8 is written in Aramaic. And so that's just an interesting side thing. You'll notice in chapter 1 that verses 3 and following that Daniel was one who could be taught, he and the other three and others could be taught the language and literature of the Chaldeans. Well, he must have learned it pretty well, because part of his book is written in it. And he was able to write in that as well. Chapter 3 is the fiery furnace. You remember reading about that. Nebuchadnezzar builds a large image of gold. If I had figured my cubits correctly, it was 90 feet tall. Now you go back and look and make sure I'm right on that when you get time to study. But he built it out in this field, and it was 90 feet tall, perhaps. And people were supposed to bow down and worship it. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused and were thrown into the fiery furnace, and yet they were saved. Interesting thing about that furnace, a side thing that we'll probably take a little side trip on when we get to chapter 3. When they threw them into the furnace, you remember that it was 7 times hotter than it normally was. I don't know how you gauge 7 times hotter, but that's what the inspired word says it was. And it was so hot, the people who threw them in died from the heat. And yet, they walked around in there and weren't singed. Their hair wasn't singed. Their clothes didn't smell like smoke and all that. But here's the thing, the side thing that we might look into as we go along during this quarter. Nebuchadnezzar looked in the furnace and he said, we threw 3 people in, but I see 4. And the one in there looks, and it depends on your translation, looks like, one translation says, the Son of God, which has led much speculation about the second person of the Godhead, God the Son, being active in the Old Testament. Other translations say he looks like a son of the gods, little g. And so we'll try to figure out who he is and who that is as we go along. We might not be successful, but we'll try to figure out who that was. The 4th chapter, Nebuchadnezzar, it's just a chapter by itself about Nebuchadnezzar having a dream and Daniel interpreting the dream, and the interpretation's not all that great, is it? Nebuchadnezzar sees this big tree, and everybody benefits from it. They live in it and around it and all that, and then it's cut down for a time, but the stump is left, and it comes back. And Daniel says, that's you. And you remember, we'll go into kind of what psychologically happened to him, maybe we don't know for sure, but he was walking around on top of the palace, apparently, and looking at what a great city it was, and according to the prediction from the dream, he was talking about how great he was, and all of a sudden he lost his mind and started crawling around on his hands and knees and eating grass, and his hair grew out and his fingernails grew out, and he lived outside, and in other words, he had a psychotic episode or something. So we'll talk about that. It's very interesting about how to humble a king. And then, as Sherry mentioned, writing on the wall in chapter 5, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar, becomes king, and the last night that he is king, he's having this drunken party, and they use the golden vessels that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem, and he's using those to drink out of and having a wild party, and he sees a hand writing on the wall, and it says, you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. I have a sermon that I preach sometimes in gospel meetings simply titled, How Much Do You Weigh? And I get that question a lot. I don't answer it, but I get it a lot. And so I made a sermon called How Much Do You Weigh? Because what it said about him was, you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. You're not a spiritual heavyweight. You're not heavy enough when it comes to what God wants you to be. And so that very night, his kingdom fell to the Medes and Persians, to Darius the Mede. And then, of course, Daniel in the lion's den. Don't bow down to any other god other than the king. And he refused to do that. He was thrown into the lion's den, and the lions didn't hurt him. But the people who accused him, after he was delivered, the people who accused him were thrown into the lion's den. And I was just reading this last night again. The translation that I use says, before their bodies hit the ground, the lions caught them and broke their bones. And I mean, that's vicious, isn't it? That's graphic. And so we'll go into all those. The visions, Daniel had a dream of 4 beasts, dream of a ram and a goat, and a prayer and a vision of 70 weeks, probably the most complicated one of all. Then a vision of the time of the end. Now, we don't know. We will talk about whether that's the end of the Jewish system in AD 70, or the end of the world in the second coming of Christ, or what end that is talking about. But chapters 10 through 12, 13 talks about the end. Historical background and timeline, 605 BC, the first group was taken into Babylonian captivity. Daniel was taken with that group. Jerusalem had been the holy city. It had been the Zion. It had been God's place where His temple was, and they could not believe that God would ever allow them to be taken into captivity, but He did. And it was in 3 waves. A second remnant was taken in 597, and then the fall of Jerusalem and the final destruction, 586. And so it happened in waves and with various people left behind each time. Then in 536, 50 years later, Babylon falls to the Medes, and that's, as we mentioned in Daniel chapter 5, the handwriting on the wall incident. Then in 536, when Medes took over, Darius received a message from God some way that he was to start allowing the people to return and rebuild the temple. And you remember Ezra and Nehemiah and a lot of the prophets, the minor prophets we studied, a lot of that involved going back and fixing walls and fixing this gate and rebuilding the temple in stages. And so they finally did that. In 457, a second remnant returned, and then about 444, a third remnant returned to Jerusalem. So, this is probably more in line with your questions that you have. Daniel would have been born about 620 BC. Now remember, BC goes down instead of up. Ours goes up. 2019, 2020, and so on, where at BC it would be 2019, 2018, and that way. And so he was taken into captivity about 605 when he was about 15, and he spent the rest of his life there, dying at about 85 or 90 years old. The captivity was 70 years. If he were 15 when he was taken, he would have been 85 when the final captivity was over, after 70 years, as prophesied by Jeremiah, you remember. And so he died there. He didn't get to go back. He spent the rest of his life there from 15 on. But he had high positions under at least 3 different kings, and so his life wasn't like those prisoners of war who were treated badly where Ezekiel saw at the river Chebar and all that. It wasn't like that, but it wasn't a free life either. He was a prisoner of war. He was a servant to the king, but a high-ranking servant because of what God did. He was probably a descendant of David. Look at chapter 1 and verse 3. The king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and so on. We'll look at that. But he was no doubt from the tribe of Judah. And he may have been a direct descendant of David. We don't know that for sure. But he was of one of those who was of royal descent. And his name means God is my judge. God is my judge. That was his Jewish name. And he was given a Babylonian name, Belteshazzar, which means protect his life. Names meant something in the Old Testament, didn't they? Daniel didn't care who was his judge other than God. He was going to do what God wanted him to do, even if the king didn't like it. Even if the king gave different orders. And he did that even as a teenager. He stayed true to the law of Moses and wouldn't defile himself with their delicacies and so on. Even though the king told him to, his thinking probably was, I have to answer to God. And is that a good philosophy? Is that a good thing to live by for you? Well, of course it is. No matter what men do to me, I have to answer first to my God. And that ought to help us to keep from compromising, ought to help us to be firm in our activities, in our daily life. He received 3 years training, and which is interesting. If he was 15 when he went there, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, along with other Jewish captives of royal descent, were placed under the guidance of Ashpenaz, master of the king's eunuchs, for 3 years, training to prepare them for ministering to the king. Can you imagine taking 3 years to get ready for this job? just to, and I don't know what ministering to the king involved. I will know by the next class because I'm curious about it, but or as much as I possibly can. But just to come before the king and do whatever your job is, you have to train for 3 years. Why? What would you have to learn? Some of the things. We know you have to learn the language. Huh? When to speak and when to be quiet. And because you could speak out of turn, interrupt a conversation or something, and lose your head. Probably there was training in when to keep your mouth shut, in the sense that you may hear something confidential about the kingdom, and you can't go out and blab it to everybody. There are several positions that require tight lips, and that would have probably been one of them. How to present yourself before a king, certain activities that would be tolerated and would not. There would be all kind of things like that he would have to learn. It took him 3 years to learn that. In chapter 1 and verse 3 through 6, we started verse 3 and got down to verse 4. They were descendants of some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, good looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to learn, quick to understand. They had to be sharp thinkers, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And so they had to understand all of those things. And then God gave Daniel understanding in visions and dreams. Verse 17, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in visions and dreams. And so Daniel was given this special ability. That's why the king called on him several times, wasn't it? I have a dream and I don't know what it meant. And in one case he didn't even know what it was. They had to tell him what he had dreamed. And so all of these things are things that we learned about him. He also learned the language and literature of the Babylonians. What language and literature was he in what was he well versed before? Well, the history of the Jews. He could probably tell you all about the slavery years in Exodus. He had read and learned those things and been taught the Old Testament, the Pentateuch. He would have known all that. He would have been fluent in Hebrew, and of course, and he had to learn another language, and he had to learn a different history. He had to know the history, the literature of the Babylonians. He also was, in his wisdom, 10 times better than the others. God had a lot to do with that, didn't he? Daniel, no doubt, was an exceptional young man. But God blessed him because God had a purpose for him being in this palace. You remember later on when Esther married a king, and her relative Mordecai said, "It may be that you have come to this position for this time. This may be the very reason you've come here." Well, God had a reason for Daniel being in this position and being held in favor. Nebuchadnezzar made him ruler over Babylon, the province of Babylon, and chief governor over the wise men. He was excelled as a statesman, and he was ruler over the province of Babylon, chapter 2 and verse 48, and chief governor or chief attendant over all the wise men. Now, not all the wise men were Jewish captives, were they? Some of them were Babylonians, Chaldeans, and they didn't like the idea of this prisoner of war being their boss. And that's one of the things that led to the lion's den and some other things. And so there would be some professional jealousy there. Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, made him third ruler in the kingdom when he interpreted, chapter 5 and verse 29, when he interpreted that writing on the wall. But that kingdom only lasted one day after that. Now, I don't know if he was still third ruler, but I do know that Darius, made him one of three ruling presidents in chapter 6 and verse 2. So apparently the third ruler was the same thing as one of three governors or presidents that he continued in that position after the fall. Do you notice how fluently he flowed from being a Jewish, and it may not have been nearly as easy as it looks and sounds in writing, but he goes from being a teenager, typical teenager of noble descent, in noble ancestry in Jerusalem. He goes from that to being trained to serve the king, to being high-ranking governing official, and he goes from Nebuchadnezzar, probably Nabopolassar first, Nebuchadnezzar's father or grandfather, and probably went from him first to Nebuchadnezzar. Then we know he went to Belshazzar, and then a whole new regime. The Babylonians are taken over by the Medes and Persians, and Daniel just flows right along and just continues in his position. That tells you a little something about the governing abilities of the Medes and Persians. They already had good people in place. They just left them there, some of them. And he's an example of religious consistency and firmness. Also an example of honesty, humility, and courage. It takes courage to hold your ground in a lost and dying world when everybody else seems to be going one way, and you know that God's way is the right way. You face that all the time in the workplace. You face it out in society, that you keep going no matter what they do. Here's what I'm going to do. Reminds you of Joshua. Choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods on the, if it seems evil to you to serve God, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods on the other side of the river that your fathers served, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now dwell. But as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. Joshua 24:15. It's tough to do that sometimes. It's easy. Teenagers especially. Daniel's a teenager. Teenagers especially. I didn't do this very well, guys. As a teenager, I didn't stand my ground very well, and I doubt that I'm the only one in the room who didn't. I doubt that. But as you get older and you mature and you realize it doesn't matter what they think of me. It doesn't matter how popular or not popular I am. What matters is whether or not God approves. That's the important thing. Honesty, humility, and courage. Could Daniel have gotten a big head, so to speak? Could he have had an ego? I look 10 times better than all the rest of you. I'm smarter than all the rest of you. I have risen from prisoner of war to third ruler in the land. But he was humble. There's another enduring quality of him, isn't it? That calls us endearing, I should have said, and enduring. Endearing quality. You got to like Daniel. I don't know anybody that doesn't like Daniel. Do you? After you read his story, because he was great, and yet he was humble. So he lived to see the captivity end and the remnant return. He would have been an old man. The captivity lasted 70 years, and he's one of the few who saw the whole thing that we know of. He saw it from beginning to end and was there for the whole thing. We don't have any record that he ever returned. He apparently died in what was Babylon. He prophesied that he was a contemporary with Ezekiel and Jeremiah. Ezekiel was in Babylon, but not in the city. He was at the river Chebar with a bunch of prisoners of war, a very different setting than where Daniel was. And then Jeremiah, of course. And then when you talk about Jeremiah, read the Lamentations. In preparation for this class, I encourage you to read the book of Lamentation, because after the destruction of Jerusalem, I tell you what Lamentation looks to me like. I don't know if it's Jeremiah. Everybody says it is, but the book doesn't say it is. But whoever it was, here's what it looks like to me. Lamentations looks to me like somebody that saw Jerusalem in its heyday And now Jerusalem is leveled, and he's walking through the streets. And you know how old men do? He's walking through the streets saying, I remember when that was there. That used to be wow, you should have seen that building before it was destroyed. And he's weeping and crying as he walks through and looks at those things. That's kind of my take on Lamentations. But you do well to read that to see from where they went to what they were, what they had become. Similarities between Daniel and Revelation. We won't go through all these. And if you want a copy of this, I'll make you a copy of it rather than you trying to write all this down. I didn't put it on your sheet because I like to keep the questions on one page. And but the kingdom of God, the same description of idolatry. Beasts with horns are in both books. Thrones are in both books. The Ancient of Days, ministering to myriads of people, or having myriads of people minister at the throne room, Revelation 5. The final advent of Christ coming, and the Ancient of Days and all of that. Judgment given to the saints. The phrase time, times, and half a time appears in both books. Falling stars, dignitaries, rulers falling from the sky. Seal the vision and don't tell anybody what it is. John and Daniel both were given those instructions. A divine man, Michael the prince or the archangel. The Great Tribulation is mentioned in both, and the Book of Life is mentioned in both. And angels holding up their hands and swearing an oath is found in both. Daniel's message, God, I don't know why I have of in there. God is superior over all idols. The superiority of God over all idols. I proofread that about 50 times. And there you go. That's the way it works. The God of Daniel is probably what that's supposed to say, is superior over all idols. I encourage you to read 2 Kings 23 through 25 and 2 Chronicles 35 through 26. All of that is a history of Babylonian captivity. It tells you about who was king and when they came and got them and all that. And it'll just kind of help you some. That is an outside assignment. And Revelation, or not Revelation, Lamentation. Read Lamentations and 2 Chronicles 35 through 36 and 2 Kings 23 through 25. So, the purpose and theology of Daniel. Daniel's personal dedication to God and God's providential protection of His people. That if Daniel's about anything else, it's got to be about that. God protects. You know why this is important now? Why is this important now in America in 2019? Are you a little bit afraid that the United States as we know it may not exist in a few years? Has that ever crossed your mind? So here's how to get through that. Here's how to go ahead and pillow your head and sleep. You belong to God. And no matter if the United States ceases to exist, you still belong to God. You see, everything Daniel had known his whole life was gone. And he was taken to a different place as a teenager, a foreign country, all brand new to him. Had to learn it all over again. Was he okay? He's all right. I'm not encouraging you to think that the United States is going to cease to exist. But to be honest with you, it wouldn't surprise me. And if it does, we're going to be okay. Well, what if we die in the coup, preacher? What if we die when... Well, then you're still going to be okay if you're all right with God, because death's a step up for us. We get to go home. We don't have to worry about it. What about my grandchildren? God will take care of them. God will take care of them, long as they're faithful. That's one thing you learn from Daniel, God's providential protection. God rules in the kingdoms of men. Every commentary, everything you pull up about Daniel, that's going to be there because it's mentioned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 7 or 8 times in the book. Daniel acknowledges one thing I've learned. God rules in the kingdoms of men. You think God's interested in the United States of America? You think He knows about us? He does. He's aware. He's aware that we're here. I think He has blessed us with a great country for a long time. And I think if He wants to, He continue to do that. He could continue to do that. And if He doesn't want to, I'm going to be okay anyway. And so that's another lesson. God is aware. He's still in control. He's faithful to His people, what I was just saying, in protecting and preserving them to fulfill His purpose. Now, I have angels in parentheses up there for this reason. One of the things you'll notice is in Daniel, there's a prominent use of angels behind the scenes, of some sort of angelic being behind the scenes. If you want to talk about, when we get to that, what their job is now, Scott, we can do that. We'll talk about that. But I think it might be a little different than what it was in Daniel's day. But we do know that there are things going on the other side of the veil of which you and I are unaware, except to say that He's going to take care of it. God is in control and will accomplish His purpose. That's another thing you learn from Daniel. And then the dream of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 at verse 44, the Messianic kingdom, the church, is not an afterthought. It was all the way over in the days of Daniel. And Ephesians chapter 1 verse 4 says, it was in the mind of God before the world began that there would be a place for His people, a body of believers gathered under the rule of the Messiah, the Savior. And so that's not a new thing. Why did I bring that up? Well, there are theories out there that say Jesus came and to set up His kingdom, but the Jews killed Him before He could do it, so He's got to come back and do it later because, and as an afterthought, as He had to find some place to put these people until He gets back, so He came up with the church. That's kind of an afterthought. There are people who actually believe that, but Daniel didn't believe it, did he? Daniel knew that there was going to be a kingdom set up that would never be destroyed, different than all those other kingdoms in that statue. The apocalyptic visions of Daniel, we mentioned them, 4 beasts, and he interprets it. His vision of the ram and the goat, his prayer and the vision of the 70 weeks. Boy, that's the one that has been the hotbed for the premillennialist, for all kinds of theories. I was telling Charles and somebody out there a while ago, Kenny, I think, we were talking, and in my research for this, I found the funniest thing. There was a guy, his last name was Applewhite, and you may have remembered him. He was in the news many years ago. He had a cult someplace. But I didn't do it. I didn't do anything. He determined from Daniel's 70 weeks that he was supposed to gather up all the old tires that he could find and pile them up around his place as a border and paint them white so that the abomination of desolation wouldn't get him when that happened. He got all that out of Daniel's 70 weeks. And interesting thing, that was thousands of years before tires were ever invented. But he got that out of there. And that is not one of the more, well, it's probably one of the more far-fetched, but it's not the only one. People find all kinds of things in the 70-week vision. I will give you some food for thought, give you a little tantalizer, a teaser here. Daniel mentions in chapter 9, 11, and 12, abomination of desolation. And in Matthew 24:15, Jesus said that at the destruction of Jerusalem, when the Roman soldiers came, Jesus specifically said, this is the abomination of desolation that Daniel talked about. And so you could just think about that. And then vision of time at the end. Why do we study this book? We studied the minor prophets. We learned a lot of neat stuff there. Why did we choose Daniel this time? Well, it helps us understand some other Bible subjects. Angels, God working behind the scenes. At least we know He did, don't we? And of course, the Hebrew writer said angels are, present tense, ministering spirits to those who are inheriting salvation. And so we know that they work behind the scene. We don't know what they do or when they do. And the safest thing to say is, when something happens and is obviously divinely organized or orchestrated, just say God did it. Did God use an angel to do it? Maybe. Did God use something, some other means, providence, whatever? Maybe. Just say God did it. God is over time and men. He is in control of time and men. And He knows what He's doing. Time doesn't really mean much to Him. He has His own time, His own timing. And you and I want everything done right now. We do learn a lesson about the kingdom of God and the timing and nature of the Messiah when He was coming, the resurrection, and God's judgment on Judah and Jerusalem. All those things come to mind. There's a lot about the book of Revelation in there. Okay, let's close it out. Be a Daniel in purpose. Daniel proposed not to defile himself. So can we. Daniel was persistent in his service to God. So can we be, always. One of the things that hurts the church is hypocrisy, not being what you appear to be. So be persistent. Daniel refused to compromise regardless of consequences. Didn't matter what happened to him, he wasn't going to compromise. So can we. Daniel had complete and continual trust in God. So can we. Okay, that's what we're going to study this next few weeks. And not next week. By the way, we didn't mention in our announcements, the Christian Leader Instructional Camp starts tomorrow. And I think we have about 8 or 9 young people who are interested in that. And what we do in that is train them to be church leaders, preachers, teachers, Bible class teachers, in leadership roles in the church, as of course, much as the Bible allows. We have girls and boys both. The girls don't speak in mixed company, and they don't teach men. When the girls speak next week, it'll be only to women in the back, and we're not going to compromise any of that. But this is what we call Click Week, Christian Leader Instructional Camp. And if you pop in over at camp this week, you might want to do that and encourage some of those young people who are training to be future leaders in the church. Thank you for your attention.